Welcome back to the Between the Levees podcast. Today's episode will be an interesting one, I think. I'm joined by a gentleman who has a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from Princeton. He was in school for his PhD at MIT 10 years before I was born. He was a former CEO of Ingram Barge, is currently a professor at Vanderbilt, and there is a 9,000 class horsepower line haul boat on the Lower Miss with his name on it. Mr. Craig E. Phillip, thank you very much for your time this morning.
Well, thank you, Tim. I am delighted to be here, and especially so since you're part of that great gang over at Ingram.
Well, thanks again. If you've seen this before, you know how this begins. Please tell me, sir, where were you born?
Tim, I was born in a suburb of Chicago, Lake Forest, Illinois, and in 1953.
What did your parents do when you were growing up?
Yeah, my mother was a public health nurse and eventually a school nurse in the school system that I went to as a child. My father was a research scientist. My dad had a really interesting story. He finished his chemical engineering schooling in 1942 and was expecting to join the military, as his older and younger brothers had both already done. And he got plucked out of the draft line and got assigned to a top secret project to help figure out how to commercially produce penicillin. And he spent the rest of the war effort on a project working and successfully so that they could produce and manufacture penicillin, which is by many considered to be one of the most important sources of success in World War II for the United States and the Allies. So when he did that, he was assigned to work for a pharmaceutical company, Abbott Laboratories, and they were headquartered outside of Chicago, and he spent his entire career there. So that was my upbringing. I was a golfer as a kid. That was part of the reason I found my way to Princeton. Spent my youthful years caddying and didn't play golf at Princeton, but that's a long story, which we don't need to go into, that found me there. Always wanted to be somebody who was going to have a career in the world of planes, trains, and automobiles. I loved transportation as a kid growing up. Looking back, if I'd had the pick, I would have said I'd like to work in the airline industry. But as it turned out, the railroads called me first, and then I later pivoted over to the maritime side and made a 30-year career at Ingram.
Well, walk me through. You get your PhD from MIT, I believe, in 1980. So still 6 years prior to my arrival here. But tell me about.
Don't keep emphasizing that.
I don't mean to rub it in. It's not my fault or yours. Yeah. But nonetheless, tell me about how your career developed. I see there was a pit stop before the railroad.
Yeah. Well, during my graduate studies, I spent a couple of years working down in Washington, D.C. for the trade association that represents the railroad industry, their equivalent of RAWO. But when I finished my PhD work, which was funded by the railroad industry or by the Federal Railroad Administration, actually part of DOT, US DOT, I was kind of at a pivot point deciding whether to go be an academic, which is why I got the PhD in the first place, or to spend some time in industry first. And one of my mentors at MIT encouraged me to go out and live in the world for a while if I was going to be a teacher of it. I didn't expect that would lead to nearly 40 years of working in the railroad and maritime industries before I found my way to academics, but that's what happened. So I worked for a railroad headquartered in Philadelphia, Conrail, for a number of years. I got a cold call from a headhunter that led me to Ingram. I worked for Ingram for 5 years and got called again and ended up working for a second railroad out in California for 4 years, and thankfully was able to return to Ingram and spent the balance of my 25 years then with Ingram before retiring.
Tell me what you can of each of those jobs, what you did, and I guess learning as you went.
Yeah, so when I joined Conrail, I was working in their marketing area, and it was a very exciting time to be in the rail industry, the railroad industry. You would not remember this, of course, but they were in a very difficult financial situation. Most of the railroad industry was either in bankruptcy or close to it. One of the primary reasons for that was the nature of regulation that was kind of had a pretty tight screws around their financial viability. So 1980, the same year I joined Conrail, was the year that they passed the Staggers Act, which was the big body of legislation that deregulated the railroad industry, and many attribute it to the reason that they survive and relatively speaking, thriving today in the freight sector. So I had a great run there. It was a wide open territory, all sorts of new opportunities to do creative things. And I really did get a cold call from a headhunter about a job down in Tennessee. As I trace it back, there was an executive down at a canal barge company, Walter Hagestad, who was their head of operations. And he was good friends with John Donnelly, who was the head of Ingram Barge Company at the time. And anyway, one of Doug's children, about the same age I was an executive with one of the other railroads. And that was the meandering kind of connectivity that led me to come down to Ingram and decide to take a job down here. It was a big move, a big change. Coming to the South, my wife was also a transportation person, and she ended up finding a great job here in Nashville working for the Transit Authority. We didn't have a family yet, so it didn't seem like a high risk opportunity. Certainly didn't know much about Ingram. Knew something about the barge business. I'd studied it, of course. And Ingram was a small company at the time, and I did learn that they had a pretty cool owner, Bronson Ingram, and was really lucky to kind of stumble into the opportunity to basically hang my wagon with a family like the Ingrams, which I was able to do. Then after I can talk about the early years at Ingram in a minute if you'd like, but I did get lured out to California to work for a railroad out there. It was one of my former colleagues at Conrail who had moved out there and taken a very senior position. And he was in the position to offer me basically anything I wanted to do out there for that railroad if I'd come and join him. And at the time, the international marketplace was just changing so rapidly. China wasn't really ascendant, but Japan and Korea were beginning to flex their muscles. Looked like they were going to take over the auto industry, for example. But anyway, for a railroad in the western part of the United States, that was a huge opportunity. It was a chance for me to take a job with them, kind of running their international marketing and sales activities and their intermodal business. And this was the Southern Pacific was the railroad, and they were the first railroad to experiment with these double stack rail cars, the ones that you now see everywhere that have the containers stacked on top of each other. And that was the biggest technological innovation in the railroad industry since they went from steam to diesel. And so all that said, it was just a chance to really play in a very, very different sandbox than I was going to get the opportunity to do at Ingram. I don't think I'm making it up to remember that when I talked, and honestly was talking to Bronson Ingram and my mentor at Ingram at the time, Neil Deal, who I can talk about a little more. Both of them were really open to the idea that this was something I probably ought to go do. And they couldn't promise me, but they did say that if and when I wanted to return, they'd be open to and enthusiastic to think about that. And of course, that's what happened. So my early years at Ingram, we were a pretty small barge line. And thinking, comparing to today with 5,000 barges and 150 boats or something like that. We had 20 boats and a couple of hundred barges, and primarily a petroleum carrier, and just beginning to get into the dry cargo business. The year before I arrived, which was 1982, the Ingrams had built the John Donnelly, at the time the first large lower Mississippi River towboat in the fleet. Certainly didn't know this at the time, but it was the last towboat that Ingram built until I think a couple of the small ones that they're not just now putting into service. And so I think the question that Bronson had was, do we grow the business? How do we grow the business? Maybe we get out of the business. There was a phenomenon that had really afflicted the industry at that time. The tax laws had been changed and made it really attractive for individual investors to own assets like barges. And so many doctors, lawyers, dentists, anybody looking for a tax shelter jumped into jumped into the business of owning barges. They'd started out doing it with railroad cars, so I learned something about that. And but the long and short of it was that the number of hopper barges in the industry from the mid 70s to the mid 80s, the number of hopper barges in the industry just about doubled. And of course, we're a supply demand driven business, and the consequence of that was really difficult in terms of the earning potential of the fleets that everybody had. So we looked around at opportunities to sell. We looked at opportunities to grow. One of the areas we grew was by beginning to take over managing those investor-owned barges. So we had at the time barges that were initialed SHE and LEA, and those were for the Shearson Partnership barges and the Lehman Partnership barges, and the MLs were the Merrill Lynch Partnership barges. So that was one way we started to grow. And then the first big acquisition we made was of Ohio Barge Company, which was the company, the house company of United States Steel. And at the time, we were about as I recall, this was in 1984, 1985, we were maybe 450 barges, and Ohio Barge Line was a little bigger than we were. So we made that acquisition. I think at the time, it felt to me for sure like a bet the ranch kind of an acquisition. And one of the most important things that ended up happening as a result of that is many individuals joined the Ingram management team from Ohio Barge Line. Most importantly was Neil Deal, who was the head of U.S. Steel's barge companies, and he joined us, became CEO of the business. Certainly for me personally, just a watershed event. Just a couple of years previous to that, I'd lost my father, and I think I'd be fair to say Neil became not only a boss and a leader and an overseer. He became a father to me. He had a couple of kids that were very near my age, and anyway, so it was reciprocal. But he became a very influential part of my time at Ingram and my life. Anyway, so that led to left for Southern Pacific for a few years. Did have the chance to come back. I was reflecting on the fact that I haven't been alone in this journey of starting at Ingram, leaving, and coming back. I think a couple of the CEOs that have followed me, the one that is currently John Roberts, was a person that I helped hire way back in the 90s, and he left and came back. And Kaz Shah also was someone who actually had worked at Ingram before I got there, left and then came back and had a long career there. So I feel like I'm in really good company, actually, of people that have managed to do a couple of tours with the Ingram family. So where else would you like to go with this, Tim?
Tell me some more about your tenure, I guess your second round with Ingram, and how that ended, and how you eventually jumped to a professorship at Vanderbilt.
Yeah. We just had we were really fortunate, I think, to be by then had owners that were really committed to the business. Of course, the same year I joined Ingram in 1982, Orrin Ingram joined, as had just finished his schooling at Vanderbilt. So we started working together, almost from the day I arrived. And his passion and about the business is pretty obvious to anyone, and I know you've had him on your podcast too. And we were really fortunate to be a privately held company that kind of foundationally wanted to take a long view of everything, and that worked beautifully in this barge marketplace that was fairly cyclical. And I would call us patient and opportunist investors. And I'm not sure I could recount all of the acquisitions that we ended up making, in addition to building hundreds and hundreds of new barges. Never a towboat, because our feeling was that there wasn't a lot of value added. If you looked at the productivity of a new towboat that might cost 3 times what a used boat would cost, we usually found with the acquisitions we'd made that people had not maintained their equipment very well. Certainly not up to what we would call an Ingram standard. but that if you invested the money and then maintained that equipment, that it was going to be as productive and have as long a life as anything you could build new. So, American Barge and Towing, MG Transport, Riverway, Tampa Electric, the biggest one, Ohio River Company, which I think was 2002 or 2003. By far, they were when we made that acquisition, I think they would be considered the second biggest company. We would have been the third. That was certainly a big watershed, event that basically pushed us into a position to be considered the largest barge company. So had great owners who were supportive of the business, and bankers behind us to make those acquisitions, and over time a pretty good track record of delivering value when we added. And we were certainly of the belief that I think has proven true, that there was tremendous economies of scale to being bigger. And I think over the years we're able to pretty handily prove that. I look at what was in the culture of the business. We fanatically embraced the notion that kind of family values was really important to us. Of course, we had the family name on every asset we owned. And I think there was one area looking back on it where I think that got in our way a little bit, and that was in the area of safety. And we kind of translated that notion of family to the operation of the vessels themselves, which is very easy to do when you think about a towboat with a captain who's effectively the father, and a cook who becomes the mother of the fleet of the boat. And I think as I look back on it, we let those vessels from a safety perspective operate too autonomously, without, I'll call them guardrails, or ultimately, the word I always embraced was sort of non-negotiables, that we want to give people freedom and flexibility, but it's within a set of constraints and boundaries. And I think I know right after I'd become president of the company, which must have been about 2000 or so, we had a fatality, and it really shook me to the core. Actually happened here on the Cumberland River, very close to our office in Nashville, and totally preventable. That led us on a safety journey, which I think I'm confident carried through to this morning, that I think has made industry a leader in that regard. For me personally, I kind of took that, what to me was an emerging understanding of how important safety was, and to kind of a lot of the work we did with the industry. Again, really blessed that the Ingram family, Bronson first, then Warren, were really supportive of us investing our time and energy in the work of the industry trade associations. And the most important things in that regard that I kind of look back on and am proud of is the work we did in the safety side. And there were two important things about that I had a lot of involvement in. One was the thing that is now called, and not always with a sense of that it's good, is Subchapter M, or the regulatory regime that was ultimately established by the Coast Guard for towboats. And as you may well remember, we had a long period of time when the towboats were kind of considered to be unregulated. We as an industry, I was the chairman of the American Waterways Operators at the time, took what was a very significant step, and we went to Congress with the Coast Guard sitting with us and said it's time for the industry to be regulated. We think that will be sensible and can be good for the industry, and it was only a matter of time before we were going to have some sort of disaster that was going to foist that on us anyway, and we would be better served to be able to manage it. And so I was very involved in that work to bring Subchapter M to the industry. It took a lot longer than anybody ever dreamed to get it from the legislation that got passed to the point with just in the last couple of years where it's now, I guess, fully effective. So I was involved in leading that activity at the industry level, and look back on that with pride. The second area is in the area of training and the emerging relationship which our industry now has with Seamen's Church Institute. And that goes back now predates Subchapter M, and I'm not sure we would have gone after the Subchapter M if we hadn't started with Seamen's Church. But about the mid '90s, a number of us in the industry were talking about the desirability of using simulator training as a tool in our toolbox to improve the training and effectiveness of especially our wheelhouse associates. And we stumbled on Seamen's Church as a partner to do that. And look back on what Seamen's Church means to the industry today, not just in the training side with that fabulous facility that they have in Paducah and now Houston, but the whole other thread of what they do in the ministry area. And think that I'm just so proud of the fact that Ingram was really important as a part of bringing Seamen's Church to the heartland. Been serving on the board of Seamen's Church for more than 20 years, and continue to feel really strongly and excited about what they brought to the industry. So those are the big things. The final area I'll note is we were always really active in almost a survival kind of strategy of trying to make sure the Corps of Engineers had enough funding to keep the waterways, the system that we rely upon, the locks and dams and levees and dredging in Washington. We were very involved. Neil Deal, my mentor, especially with his peers at the time, and this goes back into the early '90s, to create what is now Waterways Council, which I think is a really vibrant and effective advocacy group on the issues around infrastructure. Thinking back about the people that were involved at the time: Mike Hagan at ACBL, Joe Pine at Kirby, Fred Raskin at Ohio River Company at the time, Mark Kanoy with AEP, and it's Memco. And anyway, that was a heavy lift too, to get us organized and working collaboratively together, but always excited to see that they seem to be surviving and thriving, and the recent success in dollars coming into the waterway infrastructure, the money that finally completed Olmsted Lock and Dam, which was really critical to kind of the viability of the network. Really excited to see that all is continuing to this day.
Well, before we dive into your tenure there at Vanderbilt, tell me what it was like working with and for Bronson Ingram and John Donnelly.
Boy, Bronson was, I think most of the stories about him are true. They're just not enough. Orrin is like him in many ways, different in others, but just in an era almost before computers, he inhaled financial information. Never went into a meeting with him that he didn't know more than I did about the financial activities of the company. He was he didn't accept substandard work, I guess would be the way to describe it. And so he was hard on his team. But I remember on a couple of occasions listening to him in forums where he was being asked by people, well, what do you attribute the success of your company to? And it is a pretty interesting company if you look at Ingram Industries over the decades, about all the different kinds of businesses they've been in. His answer always was, I'm fanatical about finding, hiring, keeping great people, and letting them lead us where we need to go. And I can't tell you, this is him speaking now, I can't tell you there was a strategy that had a book business and a barge business and an insurance business and a coal business and a wellhead manufacturing business, all under one roof. It's not my strategy that we're there, but it's kind of the combined strategy of the people that I've hired in all of those businesses to make them a success. And he treated us that way. And he was generous with his people, generous with his support of the community here in Nashville, along with Martha, his wife, and who's still with us, thankfully. And so just a couldn't think of somebody I would have rather hung my career with than him. I'll say basically those same things about Orrin. He just loved the business so much, loved the people so much, gave me so much birth to do the job that he was asking me to do, supportive about the money, the people, the work I was doing outside the organization. So our any superior subordinate relationship has its moments. But they were just unbelievable people to have had the chance to align myself with. As far as John Donnelly is concerned, a longtime Ingram person. When I arrived, he was he was in the last years. I didn't know that at the time of his career as a longtime Nashvilleian, just a graceful Southern gentleman, tough as nails, but the heart of gold. So it was just a miracle to have found this team to have joined forces with.
What are your thoughts on intermodal containers moving via barge?
Yeah, if I'd have to point to a disappointment about my time in the industry, I would point to the fact that could never find the keys to that kingdom. And it wasn't for lack of looking. And I know Ingram is still pursuing it, and honestly, with more success than I had when I was there. So I'm really excited to see that. Over the years, I almost had a canned presentation about container on barge, and I would pull it out every time I had an Ingram board member that would go on a cruise on the Rhine River. If I knew they were going, I was just expecting this coming back, or I found out about it when they got back, because they would send me a sheaf of photographs of all the container on barge activity on the Rhine River and ask, why don't we do that here? And that would be a good subject of a podcast. And so maybe we want to organize one with a couple of other folks to talk about that. But my simple answer, which at a foundational level is to some degree true, is looking at Europe, and actually there's a tremendous container on barge activity on the Yangtze River in China. But I'll speak to Europe specifically. In Europe, if you've ever driven over there, you know that you pay as a driver, you pay about $3 or $4 a gallon in tax on the diesel or gasoline that you use for your automobile. And the same is true for the truckers that are moving cargoes in anywhere in Europe. And if you're a barge operator, you are paying $0 in tax for moving containers on the river, on the waterway. So you've started out with a huge government-inspired motivation for shippers to use the waterways, because it makes the economics, which are usually cheaper on a per mile basis, but it's all the ancillary stuff that you need to make the logistics work, the terminals and all that stuff, so foundationally it worked in Europe. And in China, it's similar. It works there because the government has decided that it's a really important objective to not have that freight moving on the highways, but to move on water. And they put their money where their mouth is through the tax structure. And we've never had that here. As a towboat operator, we pay a diesel tax, and it's about the same per gallon of diesel as the truckers pay. And so you start out you don't start out with any incentive for the shipper's part. And then you have to confront some of the realities, which is the barge operation is slower, never going to be as fast as moving a truck. And it's to some degree, it's moving in the wrong direction. If you look at the freight flows in the United States today, most of them are east to west on a containerized basis, and the freight flows of course, we go north and south. So that's a bit of a meandering, long question, but it's, I am hopeful that as the we move in a direction where emissions from transportation become more and more important, and people are focused on reducing the carbon footprint of transportation, that the advantages that barge have will become more and more important, and that will lead to more success, like Ingram is starting to have now, moving some container on barge. But it was something, and I had played in that intermodal sandbox when I was at the railroad out on the West Coast, and came back all jazzed up about being able to push that hard on our system, and it just hadn't worked out yet.
I'll be sure to include you on the panel for that Container on Barge podcast one of these days.
That would be fun. That would be fun.
Well, tell me briefly, I guess, your tenure at Vanderbilt, and I guess are you still teaching?
I am. My work at Vanderbilt is more in the research area than in the teaching area. We have a transportation center in the School of Engineering called Vector, the Vanderbilt Center for Transportation and Operational Resilience. And I work with colleagues both in engineering and across the university to secure funding to do research projects that will be work that will be helpful to our students in pursuing their graduate education, especially, but undergraduate as well. So we have a portfolio of research funded by the state government, by the federal government, by private entities. We have a big portfolio right now in the decarbonization area, and have the American Bureau of Shipping, which is a very important funder of work that we do. And so I've been starting my 8th year here at Vanderbilt, and longer than I was expecting, and I've probably got a couple more years left in me. The main teaching I've done here has been teaching professional ethics. So I get to do guest speaking at some of the courses my colleagues teach, where I can bring some of my deck plate level knowledge of the business to bear. But the thing I'm really interested in from a teaching perspective, especially for undergraduates, is helping them to understand the ethical dilemmas that they're going to face when they step out of the university environment into whatever professional life they're going to do. And for many of my undergraduate students, they get a professional engineer's license, and so they have a portion of their education that needs to be focused on ethics. So I've really enjoyed that. I guess when I start the course, I tell them that usually when we think about ethical dilemmas and ethics, we think about trying to discern between what's right and wrong. And most of the hard ethical questions and challenges that I remember facing usually related to issues where it was a matter of right and right. And that's where the rubber meets the road in terms of dealing with those kinds of things.
Well, tell me about your family. Did you have children that followed you down the engineering path?
Sort of. I have 2 daughters. They are in your generation, 38 and 36. They're both chemical engineers by undergraduate training. My older daughter ended up getting a PhD in biochemistry, and she works in Brussels, Belgium, for a large pharmaceutical company, GlaxoSmithKline. She moved over there, following her husband, who took a university teaching job at one of the universities in Belgium. Anyway, she works in the vaccines division of GlaxoSmithKline. So she started in that in 2019, and as you might imagine, with what happened early in 2020, she's had a pretty interesting run. They're a prominent player in the vaccines world, so she is fully occupied. Living a lot in the domain of how do we manufacture these vaccines that the scientists can now invent. So what was really kind of cute and cool to me was we named her Julia after my father, Julien, who was my chemical engineer dad, who of course was working on how do you manufacture penicillin. And now she's working on trying to figure out how to manufacture all these complicated vaccines that we do. And so I kind of feel like that's kind of a salute to him, which always makes me smile. My younger daughter is used her chemical engineering background to become a doctor. And so she got her MD and did a surgical residency. And she is just finishing up a fellowship to be a transplant surgeon. And we'll finish that this summer. And just in the last couple of weeks has learned that she's at the University of Wisconsin in their transplant center, and she's going to be staying at the University of Wisconsin, joining their faculty, and getting what she calls finally getting a big person job after when she adds up her undergraduate and graduate years and med school and residency and fellowship. She will have been in school 18 years since she left high school. So she's about ready for a big person's job, and just so proud of her. And I don't know how she did this, but she managed to squeeze in having a son. So I'm 3 years into being a granddad, and have to say that that's the coolest gig that I've had the chance to do. So I don't want to tell you how many times I've driven through Paducah, Kentucky in the last 36 months on my way to Madison, Wisconsin, but we make that drive at least once a month to go up there and spend some time with them. And she has a chaotic life. And so, yeah, in fact, we'll be driving by Paducah tomorrow on my way to Wisconsin.
Well, speaking of travel, I know you just went to Egypt. Fill me in on some details and highlights of that trip.
Well, of course, the Nile River is the heart and soul of everything that is Egypt, because if you're not around the Nile, you're in the Sahara Desert. It's got a lot of features that look a bit like the Mississippi River, a huge delta area between Cairo and Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast. And it's just not traveled around the world, but I've never seen the concentration of these antiquities that are present in Egypt, and just absolutely astonishing to me that the pyramids, the temples, the tombs, all date back to 1000 to 3000 BC. The pyramids themselves were built in 3000 BC. I read up on kind of as a civil engineer by training, kind of read some stuff when I was getting ready for the trip about how they built, how did they do this stuff in that era before you had the wheel, before you had, anything mechanical, basically. And the truth is, they don't really know how this all happened. At least it's not settled science, which I thought was amazing. And I would have to say that if I had to put money in a betting jar about what really happened over there, I came back from the trip feeling a little bit like the kind of the crazy conspiracy theorists that think that we must have been visited by extraterrestrials in this period. Almost feels like the only explanation for how they did all this stuff. So it's like no other place I've been around the world, and people, if they have the chance to go, it's worth a visit. I think I mentioned to you that we took a Nile cruise as part of that, and I did not realize, a little embarrassed about that they had locks and dams on the Nile River. Had a chance to ride through one of them on our cruise. I think I talked my way into the wheelhouse because I had some photos on my phone of big Ingram tows on the lower Mississippi River, and didn't speak much Egyptian. They didn't speak much English, but we managed to communicate that we were fellow mariners. So that was one of the highlights of my trip.
How different was the vessel? Do you know what the horsepower was, and what were you pushing?
Oh, this was a cruise vessel. So it was a river cruise vessel. So I think we had 120 passengers, and honestly, I don't know what the horsepower was. I never kind of dug in to ask. But let's see, how big was it? It was probably 70 feet wide and 200 feet long or something like that. So a little bigger than a single barge, but not much. And that was based on the size of the lock that they had, which was not 110 feet wide. They could fit two of those vessels into the lock chamber at the same time. So that was clearly one of the constraints in the size of the vessel they were operating.
Switching gears entirely, What do you think about
Okay.
this little podcast project I have going on?
Tim, I am. I can't remember who first alerted me to the fact that you were doing it, and it's been 6 months or so since we talked. It's so cool. I haven't listened to all of it, all of the things that are online, but every one I do is just really interesting. I learn stuff. Makes me smile. Sometimes makes me cry a little bit. It's an industry with such a rich history. And a lot of that is built around the people, and you focus like a laser on the stories behind the stuff. And so I've really appreciated the interest and passion that you have for kind of chronicling all of this and putting it out there in a place that will be preserved for a long time. So appreciate. Thank you for being inspired to do this.
Well, thank you for that. It's been it's sort of grown much larger than I expected it to in those 6 months. But to wrap up, I know we're on a bit of a time crunch here. Do you have any message for the industry, from CEOs all the way down to brand new deckhands?
I don't think we've done quite a good enough job of communicating what a spectacularly good career is available in our industry. I work for I'm on the board of a public trucking company. So I've gotten really sensitized to the issues that they have attracting and retaining people to do that hard work. And I wouldn't want to comment on whether it's harder or easier than working on a towboat. They're both got their very significant challenges, of course, but we have, I'm now speaking for the folks on the vessels, have such a spectacular opportunity for people to start as a relatively untrained person and to progress into really responsible, high-paying positions. And yes, absolutely, the work and the lifestyle is different than what many of us are accustomed to. But as we've as we've all gotten adapted to kind of different configurations of work from home, whether it's at places like Ingram or places like Vanderbilt, honestly. I point to the work we were doing and are doing out in the waterway and say, well, this is just a different kind of work from home scenario. So that's a message which I know the industry is working hard on. Individual companies, but also the AWO and National Waterways Foundation are actively working to figure out how to tell that story better, because I think it really is a great one. What's really interesting is now having a career that is more than 40 years since I've stepped foot in Ingram to today. The industry continues to be really important, really vital to the economy. Can't conceive of a scenario going forward where that doesn't continue to be the case. I think there are lots of incentives and pressures looking ahead now to the future that are going to be really favorable for the barge business. We have a great environmental footprint, best of any transportation mode, and in all sorts of other dimensions, we're friends of the community, not kind of opponents or people that are pushing a lot of negatives, as truckers and railroads are. And unfortunately, we're seeing the manifestations of probably the vulnerabilities of some of our competing modes in the rail side with some of the recent accidents that have happened. And honestly, I don't think the railroads are prepared to deal with those issues. And I think I think our industry has the right to be so doggone proud of the safety record which we've achieved. I mean, it's been years and years since we've had significant incidents that anybody would pay attention to, and that's not by accident. That's because the industry had the courage to say, we're going to deal with this issue. We're not going to hide from it. We got huge liabilities that kind of surfaced after the Exxon Valdez, but I think we responded in exactly the right way. And I've been glad to be a small part of that. And I think those are foundations that will do the industry a lot of good in years to come, even more perhaps than they've done in the past.
Well, Mr. Phillip, thank you very much for that. And thank you for your time today.
Oh, thanks, Tim. It's been a delight to be with you this morning.
We'll keep in touch.